I'm going to be upfront. This is a longer video, but if you grow in Leca or semi-hydro and your plants are struggling even though the care looks right, this video matters. A lot of the time, the issue isn't your fertilizer, your light, or your routine. It's the water your system is built on. I had my tap water professionally tested, and instead of just showing you numbers, I'm going to explain what they actually mean and how they affect your plants. In semi-hydro, water doesn't just carry nutrients. It shapes the root environment and determines how easy it is for your plant to use what you're giving it. This isn't about one number like pH or EC. It's about how everything in your water works together. By the end of this video, semi-hydro will make a lot more sense. Let's get into it. Why water chemistry matters in semi-hydro. In soil growing, the soil does a lot of work behind the scenes. It has cation exchange capacity, or CEC, which means it can temporarily hold onto nutrients like calcium, magnesium, and potassium. It also helps keep pH more stable and slows how quickly nutrients move through the root zone. Leca is very different. It has extremely low cation exchange capacity and almost no buffering ability. That means it doesn't meaningfully store nutrients and it doesn't stabilize pH. In practical terms, nutrients in Leca are only available while they're dissolved in the nutrient solution. There's no reserve in the Leca itself. If something is missing from the solution, out of balance, or chemically unavailable at that moment, the plant has nothing to fall back on. So in semi-hydro, water chemistry isn't a background variable. It's the foundation. And the first place that foundation shows up is pH. pH, alkalinity, and nutrient availability. My tap water has a pH of 7.4, which puts it slightly on the alkaline side. Before we go any further, let's quickly clarify what pH actually means. pH is simply a measure of how acidic or how alkaline your water is, on a scale from 0 to 14. A pH of 7 is neutral. Below 7 is acidic, above 7 is alkaline. In semi-hydro, the commonly recommended pH range for most houseplants is roughly 5.5 to 6.5. That range matters because it's where the widest range of plant nutrients stay dissolved in the water and available to the roots. This is the key idea. Plants can only absorb nutrients when those nutrients stay dissolved in the water. When the pH moves outside that range, some nutrients stop staying dissolved. They don't disappear, but they become harder for roots to take up. So, you can have nutrients sitting in the reservoir and the plant still struggles because it can't access them efficiently. That's why pH matters. It influences how available the nutrients are to the plant. As pH rises above about 6.5, micronutrients like iron, manganese, and zinc become less available. When pH drops too low, calcium and magnesium uptake becomes less efficient. Again, not because those nutrients are gone, but because the root environment isn't ideal. This isn't about plants crashing overnight. It's about nutrients being just a little harder to access day after day until growth slows or symptoms of nutrient deficiency start to appear. Nige, an experienced semi-hydro grower here in Australia, explained it really well. He says, pH isn't a cliff edge. Being slightly outside the ideal range slows uptake over time, the same way slightly low light slows growth. For Nige, the bigger priorities are avoiding extremes and keeping conditions stable over time, not chasing one perfect number. To understand why pH behaves the way it does in my water, we need to talk about alkalinity. Alkalinity describes how strongly water resists changes in pH. In tap water, that buffering usually comes from bicarbonates. An Australian study looking at tap and bottled water found bicarbonate levels in tap water range from roughly 12 to 79 milligrams per litre, depending on location. That explains why people using the same nutrient can have very different pH experiences. My water has a very low alkalinity, about 10 milligrams per litre as calcium carbonate. That means when I add nutrients, the pH moves easily and tends to stay where it lands. Most hydroponic nutrients are mildly acidic by design. They're formulated to counter alkaline bicarbonate-rich tap water. In my case, because alkalinity is low, there's nothing pushing the pH back up over time. If my pH dropped below 5.5 when I mix my nutrient solution, I'd consider a small adjustment upward to support calcium and magnesium uptake. If it stayed above 6.5, I'd bring it down to help keep micronutrients available. But these are corrective tools, not something I use routinely, this moving pH up or down. The goal isn't precision. It's staying within a range where nutrients remain available and uptake stays efficient. And that's the main takeaway. There's very little species-specific research telling us exact pH targets for houseplants in semi-hydro. So I treat pH as a guiding framework, not a rigid rule. Stability and context matter far more than chasing a perfect number. This is the kind of detail I focus on in my videos. EC and what the numbers actually mean. The next result on my report is EC, or electrical conductivity, and this is one of the most misunderstood measurements in semi-hydro. EC is usually shown in one of two units, microsiemens per centimeter and millisiemens per centimeter. My tap water has an EC of 61 microsiemens per centimeter. So 61 microsiemens is 0.061 millisiemens per centimeter. That is extremely low. For context, many tap waters sit between 0.2 and 0.8 EC before nutrients are added. With an EC of 0.061, what this tells me is that my water contains very few dissolved ions to begin with. Almost all of the EC my plants experience will come from the nutrients I add. A really helpful way to think about EC for houseplants comes from the lived experience of growers like Alison, also known as the long-winded Leca lady, who has tracked how different plants respond to nutrient strengths over time in semi-hydro. Based on Alison's experience, light feeders tend to prefer very low nutrient concentrations around 0.2 to 0.4 EC. Pushing higher ECs than this often causes stress before it leads to better growth. This group includes plants like spider plants, snake plants, triskancias, oxalis, strings of things, peperomias, orchids, begonias. The most common houseplants fall into what Alison categorizes as moderate feeders. A typical EC range for these plants sits between 0.4 to 0.8 EC. Plants that are known to be moderate feeders include philodendrons, Hoyas, Calatheas, African violets, anthuriums, and so many more. Why bottle instructions often fail in semi-hydro. The concept of EC is also why nutrient bottle instructions can be misleading for houseplants. Most of the recommendations are designed for crop plants grown for high yields. Vegetables, fruiting plants, plants like that. These plants have evolved to handle high nutrient concentrations for their growth cycle. Many houseplants have not. A lot of them are epiphytes or understory plants adapted to low nutrient environments. So when people mix some nutrients to bottle strength in semi-hydro, they often end up running an EC far higher than those plants are adapted for, especially in a Leca system with no buffer. So pH tells us whether the nutrients will be available, and EC tells us how concentrated the solution is. And so the next thing we need to look at is calcium and magnesium specifically, because very soft water changes how much of these nutrients your system starts with. Calcium, magnesium, and very soft water. My report shows calcium at 4.3 milligrams per liter and magnesium at 1.3. The lab also reports a total hardness at 16 milligrams per liter as calcium bicarbonate. That's a standard way of expressing combined calcium and magnesium. In Australia, water under about 60 milligrams per litre is considered soft. So at 16 milligrams per litre, my water is extremely soft, which means it contributes very little calcium or magnesium. Why this matters more in Leca than soil. In soil, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem. Soil and organic matter have cation exchange capacity. They can hold on to calcium and magnesium and release them gradually over time. But in Leca, that buffering doesn't really exist. Leca has very low cation exchange capacity, so whatever calcium and magnesium the plant receives has to be present in the nutrient solution at the moment the roots need it. Calcium and magnesium are often talked about together, but inside the plant, they behave very differently. Calcium is immobile. It doesn't move. Once it's built into plant tissue, the plant can't move it. That means new growth and root tips rely entirely on a steady external supply. We need a new supply of calcium at all times. Magnesium, on the other hand, is mobile. The plant can move magnesium from older leaves to newer tissue if it needs to. So calcium problems usually show up in distorted new growth and weak roots, while magnesium problems tend to show up as yellowing between the veins on older leaves. There's a guideline that often comes up in semi-hydro discussions, sometimes called the 5% calcium guideline. The idea is that if your fertilizer contains less than 5% calcium and your water is very soft, then your nutrient solution may not be supplying enough calcium on its own. I learned this framework from Alison, the long-winded Leca lady, and conceptually, it makes sense. Many fertilizers are formulated assuming that calcium will be coming from tap water. In my case, it clearly isn't. But this is where things become less clear-cut. My main fertilizer, Foliage Focus, contains about 1.3% calcium. Based on that guideline alone, I should be supplementing calcium all the time. And yet, I don't. I've grown large, healthy plants in Leca for years. Strong root systems, consistent new growth. Sometimes I've added calcium and magnesium, sometimes I haven't. And overall, my results have been very good. That tells me calcium availability may not just be about a percentage on a label. Based on my experience in semi-hydro, what may seem to matter most is delivery over time. How often you feed, how dilute the solution is, how healthy the roots are, and how fast the plant is growing all affect calcium uptake. A lower calcium concentration delivered consistently can behave very differently from a higher concentration delivered occasionally. Calcium moves into the plant with water, so anything that affects water movement, like temperature, airflow, humidity, and root health, also affect calcium uptake. Magnesium and balance. Magnesium adds another layer to this because calcium and magnesium share similar uptake pathways in the plant. That means they influence each other. High levels of calcium can reduce magnesium uptake, and high levels of magnesium can interfere with calcium uptake. This is one of the main reasons calcium and magnesium are often supplied together as CalMag, especially when you're working with very soft water. If your water contains very little of either and you're not treating a specific deficiency, using a combined supplement helps maintain balance rather than pushing one nutrient too far. Where people run into trouble is with blanket supplementation. Adding calcium or CalMag by default without symptoms or context can shift that balance and create new problems instead of fixing the original one. So again, this comes back to the same theme. In semi-hydro, it's not about adding more. It's about adding appropriately and keeping the system stable. So here's where I've landed with this, at least for now. When I started growing plants in Leca, I deliberately kept my nutrient setup simple. One base fertilizer, consistent feeding, and as few moving parts as possible. Looking at my water now and knowing how soft it is and how little calcium is in the fertilizer I use, I probably shouldn't have the results that I do. and yet my plants have done very well. That doesn't mean calcium supplementation isn't useful or that people who use CalMag are doing something wrong. In fact, based on my water chemistry, there's a very reasonable argument that adding calcium and magnesium more consistently could improve results further. It just hasn't been something I've prioritized so far because I wanted to understand how far a simple, stable system could go. So for me, the 5% calcium guideline is less a rule and more a prompt to ask better questions. If someone is using very soft water, a low calcium fertilizer, and they're seeing ongoing issues in new growth, then calcium or CalMag supplementation makes a lot of sense. If the plants are thriving, it's not automatically required, but it's also not off the table. Now that I have this water data, this is something I'm genuinely interested in exploring more deliberately. Testing different calcium levels, different nutrients, and seeing whether there's a measurable improvement over time. Because right now, the honest answer is that we don't have a single clear rule that applies to everyone. And I think it's more helpful to be open about that than to pretend there is. In the last section, we looked at calcium and magnesium and how they behave in the plant and why balance and delivery over time matter. There's one more piece to that picture. Calcium and magnesium don't exist in isolation. Their uptake can be affected by other ions present in the water. And this is where sodium and chloride come in. Sodium, chloride, and nutrient antagonism. This part of my water report is one of the quiet advantages in my water chemistry, and it's something that often gets overlooked in semi-hydro. My sodium came back at 3.7 milligrams per liter, my chloride at 7 milligrams per liter, and my sodium adsorption ratio, or SAR, at 0.4. I'll come back to SAR in a moment. The important point here is that all three of these values are very low. In a growth medium like Leca, that is a genuine advantage. Why sodium matters in semi-hydro. Sodium isn't an essential nutrient for most houseplants. More importantly, it interferes with nutrients that are essential. At the root surface, sodium competes with calcium, magnesium, and potassium for uptake. When sodium levels are high, plants can struggle to absorb those nutrients efficiently even when they're present in the solution. In soil, some of that competition can be softened because of the buffering. In Leca, there is no buffering. Whatever sodium is in the solution is what the roots experience directly. That's why low sodium is great to see in my water results. Chloride and sensitive plants. Chloride is another one to watch, particularly for sensitive plants. Think of your Calatheas, Barrinas, Alocasias. In very small amounts, chloride can be tolerated, and in some cases it plays minor roles in plant function. However, when chloride builds up to higher levels, it often shows up as leaf edge burn, tip dieback, or patchy tissue damage that can look like drought stress. In semi-hydro, that buildup usually happens when chloride becomes more concentrated in the nutrient solution between nutrient changes as plants take up water. With my starting chloride at just 7 milligrams per liter, there's very little risk of chloride concentrating to problematic levels between solution changes. That likely contributes to the long-term stability I've seen with plants that are often described as fussy, like Calatheas and Alocasias. What SAR tells us and why it matters. Let's get back to SAR. SAR stands for sodium adsorption ratio. It describes how dominant sodium is relative to calcium and magnesium in the water. It doesn't just ask how much sodium is present, but how much sodium is present in relation to the nutrients it competes with. An SAR of 0.4 is extremely low. That tells me sodium isn't crowding out calcium and magnesium at the root surface. So even though my calcium and magnesium levels are low overall, sodium isn't making uptake more difficult. Low sodium and chloride matter over time because they reduce the chance of salts concentrating in the nutrient solution between changes. As plants take up water, sodium and chloride tend to stay behind, which can push their concentration higher until the solution is refreshed. With low starting levels of sodium and chloride in my water, that concentration never reaches a point where it stresses the roots. That has a flow-on effect. It means I don't need aggressive flushing just to reset the system. The chemistry of the water you start with plays a big role in how often flushing is actually necessary. If your starting water is high in sodium or chloride, those salts concentrate faster and you'll need to flush more often to avoid problems. With my water, those background levels are very low, so even with a fairly relaxed flushing routine, EC stays more stable and the root environment stays calmer. And that likely explains why my plants continue to do well without frequent flushing. The takeaway here is that flushing isn't just about maintenance habits. How often you need to flush depends heavily on the chemistry of the water you're using to begin with. In semi-hydro, stability almost always matters more than chasing perfect numbers. This part of the report tells me something important. The water I'm starting with isn't working against my nutrient solution. It's not blocking calcium or magnesium, and it's not quietly adding stress at the root zone over time. That gives me stable foundation to work from. When low sodium and chloride are combined with a low alkalinity and a low starting EC, nutrient behavior becomes far more predictable and easier to manage. If this kind of breakdown is useful for you, please subscribe. This is exactly the kind of detail I focus on this channel. Once you understand your water, the next step is figuring out how to actually use that information when you're mixing and managing a nutrient solution day to day. If this kind of system level thinking helps, please subscribe. And if you want to ask questions or compare notes, my free Facebook group, Semi-Hydroponics with the Leca Queen, is linked below. The last part of the report I want to touch on looks at heavy metals. This is the section people often feel anxious about, but it's also one of the more straightforward parts of the report to interpret. Heavy metals and long-term safety. In my results, all of the heavy metals tested came back as either non-detectable or present at very low levels. That's important information in a semi-hydro setup. In soil-based systems, organic matter and clay particles can bind heavy metals and reduce how available they are to plant roots. In Leca and other inert media, that buffering doesn't exist. If heavy metals are present in the water or the nutrient solution, they stay dissolved and directly accessible to the roots. So, this part of the report isn't really about day-to-day feeding. It's about long-term exposure of my plants to heavy metals. With levels this low, there's no realistic risk of heavy metals building up to harmful levels over time for my plants. It means I don't need additional filtration for plant health. I don't need to factor heavy metals into my routine troubleshooting. If a plant struggles, I can confidently rule this out as a contributing factor. The takeaway from this section is simple. The numbers matter, but context matters more. In my case, this part of the report confirms that my water is safe for long-term use in semi-hydro without extra intervention, and that lets me focus my attention where it actually makes a difference. This is the point where this part of the report becomes especially relevant for some people. If you're on well water, bore water, tank water, or you live in a house with a very old piping, heavy metal levels can be higher. That include things like iron, manganese, copper, or lead. In a semi-hydro setup, those elements don't get buffered or locked away. If they're present in the water, they stay dissolved in the nutrient solution and are directly available to your plant's roots. That's why semi-hydro can sometimes magnify problems that may be less obvious in soil. Elevated heavy metals can show up as unexplained root damage, poor growth, or leaf symptoms that don't respond to normal nutrient or pH adjustments. If testing shows high heavy metals, the fix doesn't have to be complicated. Many people switch to using reverse osmosis water, filtered water, or rainwater as their base. They then add the nutrients back in deliberately, which resets the system and gives full control over what's reaching the plant roots. This is one of the situations where water testing really earns its keep. Without the data, it's very easy to spend months adjusting nutrients or blaming plant care when the issue is actually coming from the water itself. For me, this part of the report provides peace of mind. My water is chemically safe for long-term use in semi-hydro. But if your water source is different to mine, this is one area that's genuinely worth checking. In semi-hydro, what's in your water shows up directly at the roots. And knowing that up front can save a lot of trial and error. Should you test your water? After all of that, the obvious question is this: do you need to test your water? Not always. This isn't about creating another task you feel you should be doing. If your plants are growing well, you're seeing steady new growth, the roots look healthy, and you're not constantly troubleshooting, there's no urgent reason to test. Plenty of people grow successfully in semi-hydro without ever sending their water to a lab. But when things don't add up, if you're seeing nutrient issues that don't respond to fertilizer changes or pH adjustments, if sensitive plants never quite settle, if you're on well water, tank water, or you have older plumbing, or maybe you want to run a more controlled or an experimental setup where you're removing all the guesswork from your nutrient solution, those are all good reasons to test your water. For me, this test cost around 150 Australian dollars. That's less than the cost of replacing a single large plant. And it's information I can use across every plant I grow. For me, that made it worth it. If you take one thing from this video, let it be this. In semi-hydro, water chemistry explains more than people realize. It explains why some setups thrive and why others struggle even when the care looks the same. This test explained why my system works and where I'd look first if it ever stopped working. In the next video, I'll show you exactly how I mix my nutrient solution step by step using this water profile so you can apply the same logic to your own setups. If you grow in Leca or semi-hydro, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. If you want a deeper framework for plant care that fits busy lives, my book, Plant Parenting for Busy People, is linked below. I'll see you in the next video.